boy drowns by father's hands, returns with a chilling vision of the end. The air was thick with tension, as the early evening light fell across the serene lake, casting long shadows over the still water. The sky, once bright with the midday sun, had gradually softened into warm hues of amber and pink, reflecting on the calm surface. But beneath the water, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. The gentle ripples on the lake's surface could not hide the chaos lurking beneath it, the violent struggle of a boy who was too young to understand what was happening to him. Noah, barely 8 years old, was fighting for air, his small arms flailing against the water that surrounded him. His mouth opened in desperation, but all he could taste was salt, the cold sting of the lake's depths. His chest burned as he inhaled water, his lungs screaming for relief, but he couldn't seem to break the surface. The coldness wrapped around him, seeping into his very bones. His vision blurred, and his muscles ached, but his legs were too weak to kick, his body too tired to keep fighting. Above him, a shadow loomed, his father, standing at the edge of the lake. His face was expressionless, his eyes hollow with a kind of detachment Noah had never seen before. His hands, strong and unyielding, held Noah under the surface, forcing the boy's body deeper into the water. There was no mercy in his grip. The father didn't speak, didn't offer a comforting word. The stillness between them was unnerving, unnatural. "No, Daddy, please." Noah's panicked voice bubbled through the water as he tried to thrash against his father's grasp. His small hands reached out, clawing at his father's legs, begging for release, for the chance to breathe. But his father remained unmoved, his feet rooted firmly in the sand as if he were anchored to the lake's bedrock, completely indifferent to his child's cries. Noah's heart raced, his mind spinning in confusion. Why was this happening? What had he done wrong? He remembered moments before, moments of laughter, of playing in the sun, of swimming together in the shallows. But now this was different. This wasn't a game. This wasn't fun. The water was cold, suffocating, and terrifying. His father's face, once filled with love and protection, now seemed distant, unreadable, like a stranger's. The pressure of the water against his chest intensified, and Noah's body grew heavier as his strength drained. His small lungs burned with the need for air. His legs kicked, his body struggling against the force pulling him downward, but it was no use. The grip on him was too strong, the weight of the water too great. His limbs became limp, his movements slower, less frantic, until they ceased altogether. The world around him began to distort, the sounds of his own heartbeat growing muffled. As Noah's eyes started to lose focus, a strange sense of calm washed over him. The world, the panic, the suffocating water, it all seemed to fade into the distance. For the first time, Noah felt as though he was no longer a part of it, like he was watching from afar, detached. The world above, the trees, the lake, his father, all became like a distant dream, blurry and faint. His body no longer felt like his own. It was as if it was floating in a dark void, suspended in a space where nothing had weight, nothing had shape. The pain, the fear, it was gone. And then there was nothing. The sound of his heart pumping, the frantic rush of blood in his veins, stopped. His breath, once shallow and panicked, ceased entirely. The world around him faded into a dark, crushing silence, and Noah slipped into it without resistance. His consciousness seemed to dissipate, like the last traces of light from the sun sinking beneath the horizon. There was nothing left but the weightless void. In that moment, Noah felt no more pain, no more fear. He didn't even feel the cold water anymore. All of it, the terror, the struggle, the confusion, melted into nothingness. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. The weight of the world, the weight of his father's grip, the weight of his fear, all of it dissolved, leaving only a hollow emptiness. His body, his mind, both were lost to the abyss. But then, just as he thought he was fading into oblivion, a distant light appeared. It wasn't warm or comforting, but cold, stark, almost unsettling. It pierced the darkness, drawing Noah toward it like a magnet pulling on a weakened soul. It wasn't the comforting light of the sun, but the harsh gleam of something far more ominous. The light flickered, its coldness growing more intense, its presence drawing him in, beckoning him closer. The darkness around him began to swirl, taking shape, and in the distance, Noah could make out figures, tall, shadowy shapes moving just beyond the reach of the light. They weren't human. They weren't anything familiar. The figures were formless, intangible, like creatures from some otherworldly dimension. Their movements were erratic, unsettling, like predators stalking prey. Noah wanted to scream, wanted to escape, but his voice was gone. His body was gone. All that was left of him was a consciousness adrift in the cold abyss, surrounded by these strange, lurking entities. They weren't speaking, yet he could hear them. Their whispers, faint and indistinct, seemed to vibrate inside his mind, echoing through the empty spaces of his soul. A figure stepped forward, its presence even more terrifying than the others. The air around it seemed to distort, the space bending, warping as if reality itself were being stretched thin. The figure, though still a shadow, radiated an undeniable power, and it spoke in a language Noah couldn't understand, its voice deep and foreboding. For the briefest moment, Noah felt something cold, something unnatural, move across his very being. A presence not just around him, but inside him. It was as though the very air was alive with malevolent force. The figure's eyes, glowing a sickly yellow, locked onto him, and for a brief moment, Noah felt its gaze pierce through him into the deepest corners of his soul. It knew everything, every fear, every regret, every unanswered question. It whispered once more, its voice chilling. "You are not finished yet. The end is not what you think." Noah's mind screamed in terror, but it was too late. He had crossed over. There was no escape. Noah's mind screamed as he floated, suspended in a world of darkness and cold. He tried to move, to swim toward the light, but it felt like every attempt to move was in vain. His limbs were stiff, unresponsive, his body locked in a state of paralysis. The coldness around him felt all-encompassing, like the very air was laced with ice, freezing him to the core. He couldn't remember how he had gotten here, or why this place felt so wrong. There was no up or down, no front or back. Just endless shadows and that chilling light in the distance, the one he couldn't quite reach. He could see its edges but couldn't get any closer. It was like something was pulling him back, forcing him to stay just out of reach. The whispers were louder now, surrounding him, clawing at the edges of his thoughts. They weren't like any voices he had heard before, not like the voices of people, or even like the voice of his father when he had been alive. These whispers were ancient, primal, filled with a sorrow so deep that it made Noah's heart ache. "You cannot run from what you've become." The voice came again, closer this time. It was low, distorted, like it came from deep within the earth itself. "The end is already written for you. There is no escaping what you've done." Noah's breath caught in his throat, panic flooding through his chest. He tried to scream, to call out, but no sound came from his mouth. He opened his eyes, hoping to see the world again, but all he saw was darkness. Darkness filled with shadows, shifting shapes, and the distant, glowing light that still eluded him. "What do you want from me?" Noah's thoughts were frantic. He knew this wasn't just a dream. This wasn't just some nightmare his mind had created. This was real. This place, this sensation, this unshakable feeling of terror. The whispers seemed to answer him, but the words were garbled, indistinct. They were coming from all directions now, their voices a jumbled mess that twisted and turned like 1,000 souls trapped in an endless cycle. He could almost make out some of the words, fragments, fleeting sentences, but they never made sense. And then, as if everything had been building up to this one moment, the light flickered again, brighter than before, its cold intensity seeping into his very being. The shadows twisted and writhed in its presence, and Noah felt his heart race faster, the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. Something was coming. Something was about to happen, and he could feel it in the air, like a storm on the horizon, waiting to break. His vision blurred, and suddenly, Noah was no longer suspended in the dark void. Instead, he was floating, in the middle of a vast, desolate wasteland. The sky above was an unnatural shade of black, swirling with clouds that seemed to shift and churn like ink in water. The ground beneath him was cracked and broken, like the earth itself had been torn apart and left to rot. There was no sign of life, no trees or animals, just an endless expanse of lifeless rock and dirt. In the distance, he saw something towering over the barren landscape. It was a gate, a massive gate made of rusted iron, with sharp, twisted bars that seemed to shimmer with a faint, red glow. The gate stood against the blackened sky, flanked by two towering statues of grotesque creatures, their faces twisted in eternal snarls, their eyes glowing like fire. The whispers grew louder, more intense, as if urging him toward the gate. And in that moment, Noah understood. The gate wasn't just a structure, it was a barrier, a portal, and it was calling to him. He didn't want to go. He wanted to escape, to run, to wake up from this nightmare. But his feet moved on their own, carrying him closer to the gate, as if an invisible force were guiding him. The ground beneath his feet seemed to crack and groan with each step, as if the very earth itself was alive, breathing, shifting with his every movement. The air was thick with a stench, an unbearable, putrid smell of decay that made Noah gag. His hands pressed against his chest, trying to fight the urge to turn away, but the pull toward the gate was too strong. As he neared the gate, the shadows around it grew darker, thicker, and he could hear the distant sound of chains rattling, metal scraping against metal. The statue's eyes glowed brighter now, their gaze fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. They seemed to be waiting for him, their expressions twisted into something that was both mocking and hungry. Noah's heart pounded in his chest, his breath quick and shallow. He tried to turn away again, but his legs betrayed him, carrying him forward. The gate was now only a few feet away, and as he reached out to touch the rusted bars, a cold wind blew through the wasteland, carrying with it a low, mournful wail that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth. The wail seemed to draw the shadows closer, and as they surrounded him, Noah's vision began to blur again. The once quiet whispers erupted into loud, frantic voices, all speaking at once, too many to understand, too many to escape. The words became louder and louder, until they were deafening, crashing into his skull with an unbearable force. "You are not done." The voice came again, sharper this time, its tone filled with wrath. "This is only the beginning, boy." Noah's mind spun, his thoughts spiraling into a vortex of fear and confusion. He wanted to scream, to break free, but his body wouldn't respond. His hands trembled, his heart pounding louder than the cacophony of voices surrounding him. The gate loomed in front of him, and the shadows pressed in, as if they were consuming him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The last thing Noah saw before the world around him went black was the silhouette of the gate, its iron bars towering above him like the jaws of some great beast, ready to swallow him whole. The world around Noah began to shift, and the blackness felt almost tangible, like it was seeping into his skin, his thoughts, his very being. The eerie wail of the wind seemed to tear at his soul, dragging him deeper into this strange, horrifying realm. His chest tightened, his body shaking as he was swallowed by the swirling void that encased him. There was no way to fight it. There was no escape. The gate loomed in front of him once again, the cold metal bars now within reach. Its presence was no longer just physical. It felt like it had become a part of him, a part of his fate. The heavy chains hanging from its towering frame rattled ominously in the wind, the sound like a constant reminder of the hopelessness surrounding him. Each creak of the rusted gates felt like a beating heart, an inescapable rhythm that matched his own. As Noah moved toward the gate, each step felt heavier, as though the very air was growing thicker, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He didn't want to go any closer, didn't want to touch it, but his legs betrayed him, carrying him toward it like a puppet on strings. The voices in the air grew louder, more frantic, as if they too were waiting for him to reach his final destination. "You've crossed the line, boy." The voice rumbled from somewhere deep within the shadows, sending a chill down his spine. "There's no going back now. No redemption. No escape. You have chosen this path. You chose the water. You chose the darkness. And now it is your turn to suffer." Noah wanted to scream, to deny what he was hearing, to claw his way back to his body, back to the surface of the lake where he had been drowning just moments ago. But this place, this nightmare, had a grip on him that he couldn't shake. His skin felt cold, his limbs weak, like he was being drained of all strength and life. The air around him thickened as the gate creaked open, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. Noah stopped just before it, unable to take another step. It was as though the very act of crossing this threshold would seal his fate, would condemn him to whatever lay on the other side of the gate. And yet, the pull, the draw of it was irresistible. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't resist the force that tugged at him from beyond the gate. The darkness beyond it was suffocating, a void so complete that it seemed to swallow every shred of hope he had left. But Noah could feel something else there too, something darker, something ancient. A presence. The more he focused on it, the clearer it became. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart, revealing a gaping wound in the world where things should not be. He could hear breathing now. Low, raspy breaths. Slow, deliberate. They came from somewhere beyond the gate, beyond the veil of darkness that seemed to stretch into infinity. It sounded like the breaths of something alive, something that had no business being in this place. It made his skin crawl, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as he instinctively took a step back. But the gate pulled him forward. And with every step, the voices, the whispers, grew louder. Now, they weren't whispers anymore. They were sharp, agonized cries, pleading, demanding, screaming in a language he could barely comprehend. "It's too late, Noah." The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "You think you can escape what you've done? You think you can turn back time? You cannot. You made your choice. You drowned. You let the water take you, and now you belong here, where no light can reach you, where the past and the future are one." The world around him felt as though it was bending, warping in ways that were impossible to explain. His feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the earth itself was pulling him down, dragging him into the pit that lay beyond the gates. It was then that Noah understood what the voice had meant. The water, the drowning, it wasn't just an accident. It wasn't just an unfortunate moment in time. It had been his fate, his choice. His father's cold eyes, the way he had watched as his own son struggled, unable to break free from his grip. His father's silence had spoken louder than any words ever could. But Noah didn't know why. Why had his father done this? What was he meant to understand? Why was he here now? The breath at the back of his neck came again, closer this time, cold and heavy. A voice, distorted and low, spoke directly into his ear. "You know the truth now, don't you?" The figure behind him whispered, its words dripping with malice. "The truth of what you did, what you are now, and what you have become." Noah recoiled, but the world around him refused to let go. He couldn't escape it. It was like the truth was burning its way into his very soul, rewriting who he was, who he had ever been. He felt small, insignificant, lost. His breath hitched in his throat as he struggled to comprehend what was happening to him. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be in this place. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, frantic. He could feel the weight of the presence behind him now, pressing into his back, pushing him toward the gate, urging him to step over the threshold into whatever lay beyond. "This is your fate, Noah." The voice of the figure behind him echoed in his mind, louder than ever before. "You have crossed into the unknown, and you will never return. The water calls for you. Your father's sins have bound you here. This is your end. The end of your story." Noah's body began to shake uncontrollably as the realization sank in. This wasn't just some nightmare. This wasn't some hallucination. He had died. He was dead. And this was the place he had been forced into, a place of torment and darkness, where the echoes of his past had been forgotten by time itself. But he couldn't turn back now. The gate beckoned, its open mouth waiting for him to step forward into the abyss. The air around Noah was growing heavier, thicker, suffocating him in a way he hadn't felt since he first entered this twisted place. It wasn't just the weight of the silence that pressed on him now. It was something far more malignant, far more suffocating. The gate before him loomed larger, its rusted bars seeming to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like a heartbeat, steady and unrelenting. But beyond the gate, there was nothing but a black void, swirling with shadows that seemed to move and shift as though they were alive. Noah's feet felt heavy, like lead, as though the earth itself was working against him. He tried to move back, to turn away from the gate and the terrible unknown it promised, but his legs refused to cooperate. It was as if some unseen force, was pushing him forward, guiding him toward the threshold. He could feel the warmth of something powerful pressing against his chest, its energy a weight he could neither escape nor resist. As he struggled to step back, he caught a glimpse of the figures in the distance. They had been there the whole time, standing just beyond the gate. Their outlines were impossible to make out, as though they were too large, too far-reaching, to be fully understood. But they were real. He could sense them. He could feel their presence in the very pit of his stomach. The first figure, a shadow as tall as the sky, stepped forward, its form flickering between reality and illusion. It seemed to shimmer, like smoke caught in the wind. Its eyes glowed with a dim, fiery light, its face contorted into an expression of rage and sorrow. It seemed to look right through Noah, as though it could see the very core of him, the boy who had drowned, the boy whose father had abandoned him, the boy whose life had ended before it even began. You cannot escape the truth. The figure's voice rumbled in Noah's ears, deep and hollow, as if it came from the very earth itself. It was both familiar and terrifying, like a sound he had once heard in his nightmares, in the dark recesses of his childhood. This is your reality now. This is where you will remain, caught between two worlds, never truly alive and never fully dead. Noah felt his knees buckle beneath him, his legs no longer able to support his weight as the force of the figure's words slammed into him. He fell to the ground, but the earth beneath him was not solid. It was cold and slick, like the surface of the water where he had drowned. He could feel the wetness seeping into his skin, his clothes sticking to his body as the coldness crept deeper into his bones. The shadows moved again, and Noah's heart beat faster. He could hear the whispers now, clearer than before. But they weren't just whispers, they were voices, too many voices, each one distinct, each one pressing against his mind, pushing him further into madness. Some of the voices were familiar. He could hear his mother's voice, soft and comforting, calling his name in the distance. But it wasn't her. He knew it wasn't her. It was a twisted version of her, one that carried the weight of all the things left unsaid, all the words that should have been spoken. Other voices followed, each one more chilling than the last. His father's voice, cold and distant, filled with the same indifference that had marked their final moments together. The harsh, guttural tones of strangers, of figures he couldn't place. They all blended together, a cacophony of despair and sorrow that churned in his mind, making it impossible to focus, impossible to breathe. And then, something else. A sound that wasn't a voice at all. A sound that made his blood run cold. A scraping, tearing noise, like claws against stone, like the screeching of something far too large to be contained. The sound seemed to surround him, filling every inch of the space he stood in. His head jerked around, but there was nothing but shadows and darkness. Yet, he could feel it, the presence closing in on him. Something monstrous, something ancient and malevolent, was coming closer. He could sense it, its hunger, its need. And it was coming for him. You shouldn't have listened. The figure's voice returned, louder now, filled with anger and despair. It seemed to rip through the air, shattering everything around him. You should have turned away. You should have stayed away from the truth. Now you will face it. You will face what you've done. Noah tried to speak, but his voice was lost in the roar of the whispers, swallowed by the oppressive noise that filled the air. His body shook uncontrollably, and he could feel the coldness in his chest, a deep, gnawing fear that spread through him like wildfire. He had no idea what was happening to him, no idea why this place felt so wrong, but he knew one thing: he could not stay here. He could not remain in this world, this nightmare, this purgatory that stretched before him. The figure stepped forward, its glowing eyes flashing like fire as it looked down at him. Its form flickered again, stretching in unnatural ways, twisting and contorting as it loomed over him. It reached out, its hand long and skeletal, its fingers clawed and sharp. The very air seemed to distort around its hand, warping the space between them. "You are not meant to be here," the figure hissed, its voice sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "But you will remain. You will be here, lost and forgotten, until the end of time. And there is nothing you can do to stop it. Nothing." Noah's breath came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering in his chest as the figure's hand reached out to touch him. His body froze, paralyzed by fear, as the darkness seemed to close in around him. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't run. The figure's hand hovered just above his head, its fingers trembling with some kind of ancient energy that made his skin crawl. The world around him flickered, and for the briefest of moments, he could see it. The lake, the still waters, the place where he had drowned. His father's face, cold and uncaring, looked down at him, the last image he saw before everything went black. And then, just as quickly as the vision came, it was gone, replaced by the darkness once again. Noah's head throbbed, each heartbeat echoing through his skull as his vision swirled. The world around him twisted like a reflection in a shattered mirror, distorted, chaotic, broken. The shadows that surrounded him felt alive, pulsating with a sinister energy that seemed to reach for him, to pull him deeper into whatever dark realm he was trapped in. He could feel the weight of the figure's gaze still upon him, its presence like a suffocating blanket. The figure's words had torn through his mind, leaving a jagged trail of fear and confusion. "You are not meant to be here," it had said, "but you will remain, lost and forgotten, until the end of time." The words replayed in his mind like a broken record, each repetition more horrifying than the last. He wanted to scream, wanted to push through the suffocating darkness that enveloped him, but his body refused to obey. His limbs felt heavy, like they were encased in stone. His chest tightened with each breath, the air around him growing thick with an unbearable pressure. The wind howled through the desolate wasteland, its mournful cry filling the emptiness around him. The land stretched on in all directions, barren, lifeless, a wasteland where nothing grew and nothing moved. The horizon was jagged and broken, the sky above an endless expanse of black, swirling clouds. The light from the distant gate barely reached him now, swallowed by the thickening darkness. Noah could feel the coldness of the place creeping deeper into his bones, sinking into his very soul. He wasn't just here physically. He was here in every sense of the word, trapped in a space between life and death, between the world he had once known and something much darker, something far beyond his comprehension. "Why am I here?" Noah whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Why can't I leave?" The figure's voice returned, its tone colder now, tinged with something that sounded like sorrow, or perhaps it was mocking. "You cannot leave because you have already made your choice." Noah shuddered, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. "I didn't choose this. I didn't choose to die." No, the figure's voice grew sharp, its presence growing stronger. "But you chose what you are. What you were." The ground beneath him shifted suddenly, the earth cracking open with a deep, resounding roar. A chasm appeared in front of him, wide and endless, like a wound in the world itself. The air around him grew colder, the stench of decay and death rising from the abyss. From the depths, a low, guttural growl rose up, echoing through the empty landscape like a predator stalking its prey. Noah took a step back, his heart racing as he felt the presence of something huge, something ancient and dark, rising from the depths of the chasm. The growl grew louder, closer, as though the very ground was shaking with the force of whatever was emerging. "You are not innocent." The figure's voice was no longer just an echo. It was a force in itself, vibrating through the air, invading Noah's thoughts. "You chose to ignore the truth. You chose to stay with him. To stay with the one who brought you here. The one who killed you." Noah's legs trembled beneath him as he tried to retreat further. He had to get away. He had to wake up. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the ground beneath him felt so real. The wind biting at his skin felt real. The darkness that consumed him felt real. The pain in his chest that had been filled with water only moments ago, felt real. "Noah." The whisper came again, closer now, the voice of his father, faint but unmistakable. "You are my son. But you are not mine anymore. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. His breath caught in his throat. Not mine anymore. What did that mean? What was his father trying to tell him? His father had been the one to kill him, the one who had drowned him. But now Noah could feel it, the weight of that truth settling over him, sinking into his very soul. He could feel the rage, the guilt, the regret of his father, pulling him down into the same darkness that had swallowed him. The growl from the chasm grew louder, deafening, as something stirred in the abyss. Noah's heart raced. He had to understand. He had to know what was happening. But the more he tried to grasp at the fleeting threads of reality, the further they slipped away. "You are not meant to be here, Noah." The figure's voice was thick with finality now, its presence undeniable, crushing. "You crossed the line. You drowned. And now you will remain with us. You will join the forgotten ones." The figure stepped forward, its shape flickering in and out of existence like a broken mirror, but its eyes, those glowing, fiery eyes, remained fixed on him. They burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce through him, burning away any remnants of hope, of understanding. Noah looked down at his hands, his trembling fingers. He could see the reflection of himself in the still, dark water. His face pale, his eyes wide with terror. He could feel the hunger rising within him, deep in the pit of his stomach, a hunger he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the hunger for air, for life. It was a hunger for something darker, something ancient. And it wasn't his. It never had been. He closed his eyes tightly, willing himself to wake up. But the cold didn't stop. The shadows didn't recede. The figure didn't fade. And the growl from the chasm, the roar of something far more monstrous than anything he had ever imagined, was growing louder. Closer. Noah's head throbbed as the world around him seemed to pulse, each beat sinking with his panicked heart. The darkness in front of him, the immense chasm opening wider by the second, was no longer just a distant threat. It was a tangible presence. It was coming for him. The growl from the abyss grew louder, a rumble deep from the earth itself. It was a sound he couldn't ignore, couldn't escape. Every inch of him trembled with dread, but he couldn't look away. He couldn't run. His feet were rooted to the cold, cracked ground beneath him, his legs frozen, unyielding, like stone. The figure, looming over him, was more terrifying than ever, its features contorting as though it were made of the very darkness that surrounded them. Noah tried to speak, tried to call out for help, but no words left his mouth. It was as if the very air around him had turned to stone, thick and suffocating. There was only silence, only the crushing weight of the moment pressing down on him. The world seemed to move in slow motion, the shadows closing in, the growl vibrating in his bones. Then, just as he thought he couldn't bear it any longer, something changed. The ground beneath him shuddered, and Noah felt a cold, sharp breeze against his skin, familiar, like the air after a storm. The whispers, once chaotic and maddening, stilled. There was something else now. Something different. He opened his eyes to find himself standing in the same wasteland, but the landscape had shifted. The shadows that had surrounded him were now faint, almost non-existent, as though something had swept them away. The ground, once cracked and desolate, now seemed to breathe, slow and steady, like the pulse of a heart. Noah's feet were no longer weighted by the suffocating pull. He could move again. And then a voice. A voice he didn't expect. "Noah." His father's voice echoed across the expanse, calm and deep, as though he were standing just behind him. It was the voice Noah had heard in the water, but now it was different. Not cold, not cruel. It was soft, almost apologetic. It carried a weight that Noah couldn't quite understand. He turned, his heart racing, his body trembling. And there he was, his father, standing at the edge of the darkness, his expression unreadable. Noah wanted to call out to him, to run to him, but something held him back. The same invisible force that had been pulling him toward the gate now kept him from moving. "Father," Noah whispered, his voice shaking with uncertainty. His father stepped closer, the faintest shadow of guilt in his eyes. He didn't speak at first, only looked at Noah with those familiar, tired eyes that had once seemed so full of love before. But now, the look was different. There was something broken there. something Noah couldn't put his finger on. "It was never supposed to be like this, Noah." His father's voice was steady, but Noah could feel the weight of his words, like a heavy burden. "I never wanted this to happen to you." But the words faltered, as if the father himself didn't know how to explain, how to make sense of what had happened. It was as if he was caught between guilt and something darker, something far more sinister that Noah couldn't yet understand. Noah's stomach churned with confusion. "What do you mean? What did you do? What happened to me?" His father didn't immediately answer. Instead, he reached out slowly, his hand trembling as he extended it toward Noah. The gesture was a lifeline, an offering of something Noah couldn't name. His father's fingers hovered just above Noah's shoulder before they finally made contact, light, almost tentative. "You were never meant to drown, Noah." The words came out slow, heavy. "But there's something I've been hiding from you, something you need to know. The truth about why you're here." The moment stretched, each word carrying more weight than the last, and Noah could feel the world around him start to shift once more. The wind began to howl again, louder this time, like it was impatient, like it was waiting for something. Noah's skin tingled as the air grew colder, but his father's touch, though soft, seemed to offer him a sense of warmth that he couldn't explain. "You were never just a boy. You were never just Noah." The words hit Noah with a force he wasn't prepared for. They were like knives, sharp and deep, twisting in places Noah didn't know existed. His father's hand fell away. He looked at Noah with an expression of regret so profound that it almost crushed him. "Noah, you were chosen?" Noah's mind reeled, the weight of the statement settling over him like a cloud. "Chosen for what? What do you mean?" His father's face twisted in guilt, his eyes darting away. "You were chosen to lead them, to become one with them. The wolves, the shadows. The ones you thought were behind you. They're part of you. You are part of them." Noah felt his stomach drop. It was as if everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, his existence, had been a lie. His father's eyes flickered with something darker, and Noah could feel his breath quicken, panic rising in his chest. Noah's voice was sharp, filled with disbelief. "No, I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it." His father stepped back, his hand falling to his side. "I didn't either." His voice cracked. "But you've crossed the line, Noah. There's no going back from this. You belong to them now. You always have." A cold chill filled the air as Noah looked up, and for the first time, he saw the true horror of where he was. The shadows that had been lurking at the edge of his vision now seemed to come alive, reaching for him with an insatiable hunger. And as the figure that had haunted him whispered in his ear, Noah realized the truth. He wasn't just dead. He was marked. And the end was far closer than he could ever have imagined. Noah's heart pounded in his chest, a violent drumbeat echoing in his ears. The world around him, once filled with shadows, now felt suffocating, as if the very air was closing in around him. His father's words echoed relentlessly in his mind. "You were chosen. You belong to them now. You always have." The force of the revelation hit Noah like a wave, crushing him beneath its weight. His body felt numb, like it no longer belonged to him, and for the first time, he realized he was trapped in a place far worse than death itself. He wasn't just in some ghostly afterlife. He wasn't in the quiet, peaceful slumber he had once imagined. No, this was a prison, a realm where he could not escape, not from the curse his father had set in motion. It was as if everything that had happened to him had been carefully orchestrated, a twisted fate that he could never outrun. "I didn't ask for this." Noah screamed, his voice breaking as he looked at his father. But his father's eyes were not filled with the love that once comforted him. They were empty, cold, lost. "You can't run from it now." His father's words came in a low, resigned tone. "You never could." The shadows around them seemed to grow darker, swirling, crawling toward Noah like serpents. Their presence suffocated him, wrapped around him in a grip that was both cold and burning. They seemed to whisper, pulling at the very edges of his mind, trying to drag him into their depths. Each whisper felt like a needle, pricking at his skin, gnawing at his thoughts. Noah could feel the weight of their hunger, their desire to consume him, and it was all too much. The wind howled again, rising in a shrill, maddening crescendo, as though the very elements were conspiring against him. The ground beneath Noah's feet cracked, as if the earth itself was splitting open, creating a rift between him and whatever shred of humanity he had left. The cold seeping into his bones intensified, but it wasn't just the temperature, it was the coldness of the truth that had just been revealed. You will never be free. The voice of the figure, the one that had been lurking in the shadows, came again. It was deep and hollow, like the voice of some ancient entity that had existed long before Noah was born. You are ours now, Noah. Forever. The air around him seemed to distort, stretching, warping like an image seen through cracked glass. The ground trembled beneath him, and the very fabric of reality seemed to bend. Noah could hear the growl from the chasm again, growing louder, more furious, a deep, rumbling roar that seemed to shake the air itself. The darkness pressed in closer, wrapping around him like a vice. His father, standing motionless by his side, didn't speak. His gaze was fixed on the gate, the same gate that had stood before Noah ever since he arrived in this twisted place. But this time, it was different. The gate was open wider than before, and Noah could see beyond it, beyond the shadows and the abyss, into a void where only darkness and despair existed. And there, in the distance, Noah could see figures emerging from the depths. They were monstrous, not in size but in presence. Phantoms, shadows, lost souls, all clawing their way toward him. Their eyes gleamed in the dark, bright and hungry, and Noah could hear their whispers in his mind. They will come for you. The voice of his father, once a comfort, now sounded distant, empty. They always come for those who are marked. The creatures grew closer, their footsteps heavy and unnerving as they approached, their forms more defined now. They were not human, nor were they creatures of flesh and bone. They were something else, something beyond comprehension, and yet, they were drawn to Noah like vultures to carrion. No! Noah shouted, his voice raw with panic. He tried to run, to escape, but his body betrayed him. He couldn't move. His feet were locked in place, the weight of the figures surrounding him pressing down on him, their presence suffocating him. The voices in the air grew louder, their whispers melding into a chorus of cries, all pleading, all demanding. Noah wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but he couldn't. He couldn't escape the fate that had been sealed long ago. He was trapped. There was no way out. And then, just as the creatures closed in around him, something changed. The figures halted, their gazes locked on Noah with an intensity that felt like fire burning through him. The air around him crackled, heavy with an unseen energy, and for the first time, Noah felt something shift within himself. A strange, unearthly power that was growing inside him, spreading through his veins, filling him with an overwhelming sense of strength. Noah turned to his father, his heart racing. "What is this?" he asked, his voice shaking with fear and confusion. "What are they? What is this power?" His father's face was unreadable, a mask of sorrow and regret. He didn't answer, but his eyes were filled with something else, something deeper, darker. It was as if his father had known all along that this moment would come. That Noah would one day be pulled into this dark existence, where there was no escape. The gate, the abyss, the figures, they were all a part of the fate Noah had unwittingly embraced. "You belong to them now," his father whispered, his voice barely audible. "And they belong to you." Noah's body convulsed with an alien energy, an ancient power that surged through him, filling him with both fear and awe. He could feel the darkness within him now, feel it stirring beneath the surface, just as the creatures closed in, their glowing eyes fixed on him. His father stood motionless beside him, his face pale, filled with regret and sorrow. The creatures paused before them, watching Noah with a kind of reverence, as if waiting for something. But for the first time, Noah realized that he wasn't just a passive participant in this moment. He wasn't just a victim of the forces that had brought him here. He had a choice. In that instant, Noah understood that the power coursing through him was more than just dark energy. It was a key, his key, to either remain trapped in this nightmarish realm forever, or to find a way out. The gate, the figures, the voices, they were all just part of the test. The moment had come for him to make his choice. "You cannot escape this fate," the voice of the creature closest to him rumbled, its tone deep and oppressive. "You are ours now. You belong to us. There is no other way." Noah's fists clenched at his sides as he faced the creature, his body trembling. He could feel the darkness, the weight of the power, threatening to consume him, but he didn't want it. He didn't want this fate. He didn't want to become one of them, lost to the shadows, to the abyss. He wanted to live. He wanted to go back, to feel the warmth of the sun on his face again, to breathe freely, to be a child again. "I don't belong to you," Noah shouted, his voice filled with a newfound strength. The words seemed to echo through the abyss, bouncing off the walls of the wasteland, reverberating in the air. The figure closest to him recoiled, its eyes flashing with something like surprise. The others seemed to hesitate as well, sensing the shift in the air, the change in Noah. For the first time since he had arrived in this twisted place, the power within him wasn't just a source of terror. It was a source of defiance, a refusal to be consumed by the darkness. "Noah," his father's voice whispered, barely audible, a tremor of fear in his tone. "You can't fight it. It's too late." But Noah didn't listen. The power inside him swelled, its force growing stronger with every heartbeat, every breath. He could feel it reaching toward the figures surrounding him, reaching for the abyss itself, and he knew with every fiber of his being that he could fight back. The gate before him seemed to tremble, as if it were on the verge of closing. The figures around him began to recoil, their once threatening presence now faltering in the face of Noah's defiance. They seemed confused, disoriented, as though the power he now commanded was something they had not expected, something they had not foreseen. Noah reached out, his hands trembling, his fingers brushing the gate's cold metal bars. But instead of being sucked into the darkness beyond, he felt the power within him surge outward, pushing the shadows back, pushing the gate away. The creatures screamed, their forms writhing as the darkness around them seemed to waver, to falter. "No!" Noah cried, his voice echoing through the vast, empty space. "I'm not one of you." The air crackled with energy, a pulse of power rippling outward from Noah, as if the very fabric of the realm was bending, warping. The creatures, their forms twisting, began to dissipate into the air, their shadows breaking apart, unraveling like smoke in the wind. The gate, once so menacing, began to lose its grip on the reality that held it in place. It shuddered, the iron bars groaning, before it finally broke apart, splintering into shards of darkness that faded into nothing. But with it went the terror, the suffocating fear that had haunted him since the moment he had drowned. The creatures, the shadows, the abyss, they were gone. His father stood in front of him, his face pale, his eyes wide with something between disbelief and awe. The air was still now quiet, eerily so. And Noah realized, for the first time, that his father was no longer a figure of authority or power. He was a broken man, lost in a world that Noah had escaped from. But Noah wasn't free yet. Not entirely. The truth had been revealed to him. He was forever marked by the waters, by the death that had claimed him, and by the power that still simmered beneath the surface. But he had taken control. For the first time in this dark world, he had fought back.